Jackson Cole had been in some bad situations before, but this was on a whole new level. The transport ship's metal doors screeched open, flooding the confined space with blinding white light. He squinted, adjusting to the brightness as the cold air of Zephyra Prime's prison yard washed over him. The cuffs around his wrists and ankles were tight, the kind designed for the most dangerous criminals. His muscles tensed as he stepped forward, boots scraping against the hard surface. Then he heard it, a low, menacing hum, like a storm waiting to explode. Hundreds of alien women stood in the massive open yard, watching him with a mix of amusement, curiosity, and something far more dangerous, predatory interest. They were from different species, warriors, assassins, and convicts from across the galaxy, each one powerful enough to rip a man apart. And now, for the first time in Zephyra Prime's history, a human male had been thrown into their midst. Jackson felt their eyes burning into him. The crowd parted as a towering figure stepped forward, a reptilian behemoth with jagged spikes running down her arms. Varaka, 7 feet of muscle and bloodlust, a war criminal from the Drakshur Empire. She bared her sharp teeth in a cruel grin. A male. Her voice was thick with amusement and disbelief. "You've got to be joking." Laughter rippled through the crowd, but there was something else underneath it, a hunger, a challenge. Jackson knew exactly what was about to happen. The guards behind him didn't even bother to step in. They simply unshackled his cuffs and backed away, their amusement barely concealed. "You survive, you stay," one of them chuckled before walking off. Jackson rolled his shoulders, feeling the weight of the situation settle on him. He was alone. No weapons, no armor, just his training, his instincts, and the fact that every single one of these women wanted to see what he was made of. Varaka didn't wait. She lunged at him, moving faster than something her size should be able to. Her claws slashed through the air where his head had been a second earlier. Jackson ducked, pivoted, and drove an elbow into her ribs, but it was like hitting a steel wall. Pain shot up his arm. Varaka grinned. "You hit like a child." Her tail whipped around, catching him off guard. The impact sent him skidding across the ground, dust rising around him. The crowd roared with excitement. Jackson exhaled sharply, rolling onto his feet. His ribs ached, but he'd been through worse. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but humans had one advantage most aliens didn't expect: adaptability. Varaka charged again. This time, Jackson didn't dodge completely. He sidestepped at the last second, grabbing her outstretched arm and using her momentum against her. With a powerful twist, he sent her crashing to the ground. The force of it sent a shockwave through the yard. The crowd went dead silent. Jackson stepped back, breathing hard. Varaka groaned, shaking her head as she sat up. Then, she laughed. "Interesting," she muttered, wiping blood from her lips. "I think I like you, human." The silence shattered as the other prisoners erupted into noise. Some were impressed, others furious. And standing on the balcony above, overseeing it all, was Warden Illyria. Her ice-blue eyes studied Jackson, with something unreadable. Then she turned and disappeared inside. Jackson had survived his first day, but he had a feeling things were about to get a lot worse. Jackson sat on the edge of his bunk in the dimly lit cell, his muscles aching from the fight with Varaka. He had been in the prison for less than a day, but he already knew how things worked here. Zephyra Prime wasn't just a prison. It was a battleground, and he had just stepped into the middle of a war. The prison was divided into factions. Some of them were built around strength, others around cunning, but they all had one thing in common. They wanted control. And now, with a human male suddenly thrown into their world, the balance of power had been disturbed. The first sign of trouble came when his cell door slid open without warning. Jackson didn't react right away. He knew better than to look surprised. 3 figures stepped inside, their movements smooth and predatory. The one in the center was tall, with silver skin that shimmered under the dim lighting. Her violet eyes studied him with cold amusement. Zevara, leader of the Sirens, one of the most dangerous groups in the prison. Unlike Varaka's brute strength, Zevara and her kind relied on something far deadlier: mind control. Jackson had heard the stories. The Sirens could whisper a single word and make prisoners turn against their own friends. They could manipulate, deceive, and bend people to their will. And now, Zevara was standing in front of him, smiling like a predator that had just cornered its prey. "A human," she murmured, tilting her head. "I've never played with one of your kind before." The two women flanking her chuckled, their eyes glowing faintly. Jackson leaned back, keeping his expression neutral. "I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing." Zevara laughed softly. "Oh, you will be." She stepped closer, reaching out as if to brush her fingers against his face. Jackson didn't move, but every muscle in his body tensed. He had read about the effects of siren touch, how a single caress could lull someone into a state of hypnosis. Her fingers hovered just inches from his skin, and then she whispered, "Sleep." A wave of dizziness washed over him. His mind felt sluggish, like he was sinking into warm water. Images flickered behind his eyes. Memories, dreams, illusions. His breathing slowed. He could feel her voice wrapping around him, pulling him under. And then, nothing. Jackson's eyes snapped open. The dizziness vanished like a switch had been flipped. He was fully alert, fully in control. Zevara frowned, her amusement slipping for the first time. "That's unexpected," she muttered. Jackson smirked. "Sorry to disappoint." Before she could react, he grabbed her wrist and twisted. Zevara gasped as he yanked her forward, spinning her around and pinning her arm behind her back. The two Sirens behind her moved, but Jackson pressed his grip harder. "Tell them to stop," he said calmly. Zevara's breath was unsteady, but she smiled. "Impressive. No one's ever resisted before." She signaled her followers to back down. Jackson released her and stepped away, keeping his guard up. Zevara rubbed her wrist, watching him with newfound interest. "You're different," she said. "I like that." She turned and walked out of the cell, but before leaving, she glanced over her shoulder. "This isn't over, human." Jackson exhaled, shaking his head. He had just made another enemy, or maybe something worse. The next few days were a test of survival. Every faction in the prison was watching him, trying to figure out what to do with him. Some wanted him dead, others wanted him as an ally, and then there were those who saw him as something else entirely. The Amazons, a group of towering warrior women, invited him to the training yard. At first, he thought they were offering an alliance. He quickly realized they were testing him. One by one, they challenged him to fights, not to kill him, but to see if he was worth respecting. He fought 5 of them in a row. By the end, his body was bruised and aching, but he was still standing. That earned him a nod from their leader, Kayla, a warrior with bronze skin and piercing green eyes. "You're not weak," she admitted. "That's good." Jackson wasn't sure if that meant they would protect him or if they were just waiting for another chance to fight him again. Not all encounters were as direct. The Feline Assassins, a stealthy group that controlled most of the black market trade in the prison, watched him from the shadows. He caught glimpses of them in the corridors, their sharp eyes tracking his every move. One night, he found a small knife left on his bed. A warning. A gift. He wasn't sure. Through it all, Warden Illyria remained an enigma. He saw her occasionally, standing on the observation balcony, watching him with unreadable eyes. She never spoke to him directly, but he could feel her presence like a cold shadow. She was dangerous, maybe more dangerous than any of the prisoners. Then, on the 7th night, the real test came. Jackson had just returned to his cell when the lights flickered. A deep mechanical voice echoed through the prison. "Attention. Intruder detected. Termination protocol activated." The doors of the cells locked automatically. Jackson frowned. stepping toward the bars. That's when he saw it. A massive AI-controlled security drone hovered into view, its sleek, silver body reflecting the dim light. It was different from the usual guards, faster, more lethal, and its targeting system was locked onto him. Jackson barely had time to react before it fired. He dove to the side, the energy blast scorching the wall behind him. The force of the explosion shook the floor, and alarms blared across the prison. The other prisoners screamed, hammering against their cell doors. Jackson rolled onto his feet, heart pounding. This wasn't just a security measure. This was an execution. Someone wanted him dead, and they had just sent a machine to do the job. Jackson barely had time to breathe before the security drone fired again. The plasma bolt tore through the air, scorching the metal walls behind him. He dived behind the cot, his mind racing. This wasn't a routine security check. Someone had activated this thing to kill him. But why? Who had the power to override the prison systems? The other prisoners were screaming, pounding on their locked doors. A few tried to override their cell panels, but the lockdown had sealed them in tight. Jackson knew he couldn't count on anyone to help. Not yet. He had to survive first. The drone hovered closer, its mechanical eye scanning for movement. Jackson spotted a loose panel in the floor, a maintenance hatch. It was his only chance. He sprinted forward just as the drone fired again. The explosion sent heat washing over his back, but he ignored it, grabbing the panel's edge and yanking it open. He dropped into the darkness just as another blast erupted above him. The air ducts were narrow, filled with cables and old machinery. He crawled forward, forcing himself to move quickly despite the burning in his arms. He had no idea where this tunnel led, but anywhere was better than facing that drone in an open cell. He crawled for what felt like forever, turning whenever he heard guards or alarms echoing above him. Finally, he found another panel, this one marked with unfamiliar alien symbols. He hesitated for a second before kicking it open. The moment he climbed out, he found himself staring at a curved blade, just inches from his throat. Kayla, the Amazon warrior, held the weapon steady, her green eyes narrowed. Behind her stood two other women from her faction, their hands resting on their weapons. "You're either very stupid or very lucky," Kayla muttered, lowering her blade slightly. Jackson straightened, breathing hard. "I'll take lucky." The other Amazons exchanged looks, clearly unsure what to do with him. No male had ever escaped a security lockdown before. That alone made him an anomaly. But Kayla seemed intrigued. She crossed her arms, considering him for a long moment. "You just survived an assassination attempt," she said finally. "That means you have powerful enemies." Jackson exhaled. "No kidding." She nodded, then jerked her head toward the corridor. "Come with me." He didn't have much choice. Staying here alone meant death. He followed her through a series of dark hallways, deeper into the restricted zones of the prison. They moved quickly, avoiding patrols and security drones still sweeping for him. Eventually, they arrived at what looked like an old storage room. The moment Kayla pushed open the heavy door, a wave of heat and noise hit him. Inside, a group of prisoners were gathered, sitting around makeshift tables and crates. The air smelled of oil and burnt metal. Weapons, stolen tech, and scavenged gear lay scattered everywhere. Jackson realized what this was: a war camp. Kayla motioned for him to sit, and the others watched as she stepped forward. "We all want out of here," she said simply, "and now we have a problem. The prison has turned against one of its own." The others muttered among themselves. Jackson rubbed his jaw. "I don't know who gave the kill order, but I have a few guesses." "Warden Illyria," one of the women said grimly. "She doesn't like variables in her system." Jackson frowned. "That doesn't make sense. She was watching me, but she never seemed." "It's not just her," another voice cut in. He turned to see Zavara, the leader of the Sirens, standing near the entrance. Her violet eyes locked onto his, unreadable as always. "Someone powerful is playing a game. And you, human, are at the center of it." Jackson wasn't sure how to take that. Great. Love being a pawn. Zavera smirked, then stopped being one. The tension in the room thickened. The factions didn't trust each other. The Sirens, the Amazons, and a few scattered outcasts. Normally, they would be at each other's throats. But now, they had something in common. They were all prisoners. And they all wanted out. Kayla finally spoke. An escape attempt has never worked before. The warden controls everything. The guards, the drones, the power supply. The moment anyone tries, they're put down. Jackson thought for a moment. That's because they were small-scale escapes. What if we did something bigger? Kayla raised an eyebrow. Bigger? Jackson leaned forward. We don't escape like prisoners. We escape like soldiers. The others fell silent. Jackson tapped the metal table. I was a combat engineer before all this. I've broken into places more secure than this one. The problem isn't getting out. It's making sure we don't get caught before we even reach the outer walls. Kayla folded her arms. And how do you plan to do that? Jackson glanced around the room, then turned to Zavera. You can manipulate minds, right? Make people see what they want to see. She smirked. To a degree. He nodded. Good. We're going to need a distraction. Jackson outlined his plan quickly. First, they needed a power surge to overload the security systems. That would give them a window to move through restricted zones without getting flagged. Second, they needed a riot. Something big enough to draw every guard and drone to one location. Third, they needed a way past the outer perimeter. That was the hardest part. The prison was surrounded by energy barriers strong enough to vaporize anything that touched them. That's where Zavera's sirens came in. If they could manipulate the guards into believing there was a security breach elsewhere, they could temporarily deactivate the barriers without raising suspicion. It was insane. It was reckless. And it was their only shot. Kayla exhaled, running a hand through her hair. This is suicide. Jackson smirked. Only if we do it wrong. The room fell into tense silence as the factions considered their options. Then, one by one, they nodded. They had a plan. Now they just had to survive long enough to make it happen. The plan was set. Jackson knew there was no turning back now. If they failed, they'd all be executed, or worse, but there was no other way. The only path left was forward. The prison hummed with an eerie silence, the kind that came before a storm. Jackson and his allies moved carefully through the restricted corridors, avoiding security drones and patrols. Every step had to be perfect. One mistake, and the plan would fall apart before it even started. Zavera's sirens had already begun their work, whispering illusions into the minds of the guards. The warden's elite enforcers were being fed false information, glitches in the security feed, phantom movements in different cell blocks, distractions that kept them looking everywhere but here. Meanwhile, Kayla and her Amazons had infiltrated the main barracks. They'd cut off emergency communication lines and sabotaged key weapons caches, ensuring the guards couldn't mobilize quickly. Everything was going according to plan. Jackson's heart pounded as he crouched near a ventilation shaft, watching as the power levels flickered on his stolen security tablet. The energy core that powered the barrier was overloading, just as planned. They had exactly 7 minutes before the entire prison went into lockdown. He turned to Zavera, who stood next to him with an amused look. Showtime. She smirked and placed 2 fingers on her temple, focusing. Moments later, distant alarms started blaring. Shouts echoed through the corridors as the illusion spread. To the guards, it looked as if an entire wing of the prison had exploded into chaos. They rushed toward the false emergency, leaving the real battleground unguarded. Jackson and his group moved. Kayla led the charge, taking down the few remaining guards with brutal efficiency. The Amazons were warriors, trained for combat. They moved like a storm, cutting through anyone in their path. Jackson followed closely, keeping his eyes on the security tablet. The warden hadn't noticed yet. That was good. They reached the central control room, where the final part of the plan had to be executed. If they could override the outer security locks, they could open an escape route to the prison's lower maintenance tunnels. Jackson sprinted to the console, his fingers flying over the controls. Almost there. Just a few more seconds. The door behind him slammed shut. A chilling voice filled the room. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" Jackson's stomach turned to ice. Warden Illyria. She stood at the entrance, flanked by a squad of heavily armored enforcers. Unlike the regular guards, these soldiers were elite. Faster, stronger, and ruthless. And Jackson's worst fear had just come true. Someone had betrayed them. He glanced at Kayla and Zavara, but they looked just as shocked as he felt, which meant the traitor was someone else, someone inside their own ranks. Illyria stepped forward, her cold violet eyes locking onto Jackson. "I was curious to see how far you'd go. But honestly, I expected more." The enforcers raised their weapons. Jackson's mind raced. They were trapped. There was no way out of this room. The only exit was now blocked by the warden herself. Kayla growled, stepping forward. "We're not going down without a fight." Illyria smirked. "Oh, I know." And then the enforcers attacked. The room exploded into chaos. Plasma fire tore through the air as Jackson dived behind the console, barely avoiding the first few shots. The Amazons fought viciously, their blades flashing in the dim light. Zevara's sirens unleashed their mental attacks, trying to disorient the guards. Jackson gritted his teeth. He had to think. Fast. The security panel was still active, if he could override the doors. Then he saw her. The traitor. One of the prisoners. Lyora, a quiet woman who had never seemed like a threat, was at the back of the room, accessing a hidden comm device. She had been feeding information to the warden the entire time. Jackson's blood ran cold. She saw him staring and smirked. "You should have known better, human." Jackson didn't hesitate. He lunged. Lyora tried to draw her weapon, but he was faster. He tackled her to the ground, knocking the comm device from her hands. She struggled, kicking and cursing, but Jackson pinned her down. "You sold us out," he hissed. Lyora spat blood and sneered. "Did you really think you were special? That you could change anything? This prison belongs to the warden. And soon, so will you." Jackson clenched his jaw. He didn't have time for this. The fight around them was brutal. Kayla had taken down 2 enforcers, but more were swarming in. Zevara was bleeding, her illusions faltering under the sheer force of the warden's soldiers. They were losing. Jackson made a split-second decision. He grabbed Lyora's stolen security badge and sprinted back to the console. The door override. He had one chance. He slammed the badge against the scanner, hacking into the system. The screen flashed red. Denied. He cursed and tried again. Another plasma bolt whizzed past his head. The console sparked. Then the screen flickered. Override accepted. The security doors burst open. Kayla and Zevara didn't need instructions. They grabbed the wounded and ran. Jackson turned back to Lyora, who was still on the ground, glaring at him. "You'll regret this," she spat. Jackson exhaled. "Not today." Then he turned and ran. They sprinted through the corridors as alarms blared, guards flooding the halls. The prison was in full lockdown now, but it was too late. The riot had spread. Prisoners everywhere were fighting back, taking control of different sectors. The revolt had begun, but they weren't free yet. The final obstacle lay ahead, the outer gates, and Jackson knew the warden wouldn't let them reach it without a fight. The prison was chaos. Alarms blared from every direction, warning sirens screaming across the halls. Smoke from broken machinery and energy weapon fire filled the air, making it hard to see. But Jackson and his group didn't stop running. They couldn't. The path ahead was the only chance they had, and the warden wouldn't let them take it easily. Jackson could feel the weight of every second slipping away. The riot had distracted most of the guards, but not all of them. More enforcers would be coming, and when they did, this fragile window of escape would slam shut. Kayla ran ahead, leading the charge. Her strength and speed gave her an edge, and she cut down any guard foolish enough to block their way. Behind them, Zevera staggered, still wounded from the last fight. But she kept moving. Jackson knew they were pushing their limits, but stopping meant death. They reached the last security checkpoint before the outer gates. It was a massive metal corridor reinforced with plasma barriers. Beyond that lay the final stretch, the docking bay. Jackson skidded to a stop at the console, trying to hack into the system. His fingers flew across the screen, but the red warning symbols flashed over and over. The security override wasn't working. The system had gone into full lockdown. "This isn't good," he muttered, his pulse pounding. Kayla looked over his shoulder. "What's wrong?" "The warden must have triggered a lockdown. The only way past is a manual override." Zevera's breath came in ragged gasps. "Then we fight our way through." Before Jackson could respond, a new sound filled the air. Heavy boots, marching in perfect formation. The enforcers had arrived. Jackson turned just as the first plasma shots rained down on them. He ducked, barely avoiding the burning heat. Kayla roared and charged forward, her blades flashing as she clashed with the nearest enforcers. Jackson grabbed his stolen weapon and fired back. The corridor became a battlefield, with smoke and sparks flying as energy bolts struck metal walls. The enforcers were stronger, better armed, but Jackson and his team had desperation on their side. They had nothing left to lose. But then, a cold voice cut through the chaos. "That's enough." Everything froze. Warden Illyria stepped forward. She was calm, untouched by the destruction around her. She walked with the confidence of someone who had already won. The enforcers parted as she moved, her violet eyes locking onto Jackson. He gripped his weapon tighter. Illyria tilted her head slightly. "You've made it far, human. Farther than anyone expected." Jackson didn't answer. He just kept his finger on the trigger, ready to fire. She sighed. "Lower your weapon." Silence stretched between them. The air felt heavy, tense. Then, slowly, Zevera stepped forward. "Illyria," she said, her voice careful. "Why are you here? You could have sent more enforcers. You could have killed us already." The warden smiled faintly. "Yes, I could have." Jackson's grip tightened. He didn't trust this. Not for a second. Illyria glanced at the destroyed security console. "You want to escape," she said. "You think you've won." Kayla growled. "We have." The warden's smirk didn't fade. "No, you haven't." Then she lifted her hand, and the entire prison shook. Jackson's stomach dropped as the walls trembled. The lights flickered. A deep mechanical rumble vibrated beneath their feet. Zevera paled. "She's activating the failsafe." Jackson's heart pounded. "What failsafe?" "The prison's core," Zevera whispered. "She's overloading it. If it melts down..." Jackson realized the truth before she could finish. The warden wasn't trying to stop them. She was going to destroy the entire prison. Every prisoner. Every guard. Everyone. Jackson turned back to Illyria. "You'd kill yourself just to stop us." She smiled. "I would do what is necessary." For a second, no one moved. Then Jackson made his decision. He lunged. Illyria dodged effortlessly, stepping back just as he swung at her. She was fast, faster than he'd expected. But Jackson didn't stop. He pressed forward, throwing every bit of strength he had into his attacks. Illyria blocked him at every turn. She wasn't just a warden. She was a warrior. She had been trained for this. Kayla joined the fight, striking from the side. Illyria barely reacted, her movements smooth and precise. She countered Kayla's attacks with ease, dodging and deflecting with the grace of someone who had never lost a fight in her life. Jackson clenched his teeth. They were running out of time. Then Zevera screamed. Jackson barely had time to react before he saw her fall. A plasma bolt had struck her side. One of the enforcers had gotten a clear shot. She collapsed to the ground, her body twitching in pain. Jackson's rage flared. He turned back to Illyria, his breath ragged. "Stop this." She raised an eyebrow. "Make me." Jackson had one last trick left. With a sudden move, he grabbed the fallen plasma rifle and fired at the control panel behind Illyria. The shot struck perfectly. The panel exploded in a shower of sparks. The security barriers failed. The outer gates unlocked. Kayla didn't hesitate. She grabbed Zavara's injured form and ran. Jackson followed, sprinting toward the docking bay. Behind them, Illyria stood still, watching them go. She didn't chase them. As Jackson ran, he realized the truth. Illyria had let them go. But why? They reached the docking bay, where a stolen transport ship waited. The engines roared as the remaining prisoners piled in. Jackson took one last look back at the prison. Smoke billowed from the damaged halls. Chaos raged inside. And in the center of it all, Illyria stood watching. Jackson clenched his fists. This wasn't over. Not yet. Then he stepped onto the ship. The doors sealed, and they blasted into the stars. The stolen transport ship cut through the void of space, its engines roaring as it fled the doomed prison station. Jackson sat near the cockpit, his hands gripping the armrests as he watched the chaos unfold through the viewport. The once mighty prison, a fortress meant to break the strongest of minds, was now crumbling into itself, its power core melting down just as Zavara had warned. Explosions rippled across its surface, and for a moment he could swear he saw a shadow standing in the flames, watching. Illyria. Jackson's breath was heavy, his heart pounding. They had done it. They had escaped. But something about it felt unfinished. Illyria had let them go. She had the power to stop them, yet she hadn't. And now, that prison, her kingdom, was gone. Zavara groaned beside him, clutching her wounded side. "We need to get to a med bay." Kayla, still gripping a stolen rifle, nodded. "We should set a course for neutral space. The Empire will send warships once they realize what happened." Jackson exhaled slowly. "We're not safe yet." The stolen ship had barely enough fuel to reach the nearest free zone, but the real problem was what came next. They were escaped prisoners, outlaws in alien space. They had nowhere to go, no allies, and a very powerful enemy who would be hunting them soon. A sharp beeping interrupted his thoughts. The ship's sensors had picked up something. Jackson leaned forward. "What is it?" Kayla checked the display. Her expression darkened. "A battleship. Imperial markings." Jackson cursed. "Already. They must have been tracking us." Zavara forced herself to sit up. "We won't outrun them. Our ship isn't fast enough." Jackson knew she was right. They had taken a cargo vessel, not a warship. They had weapons, but a full-fledged Imperial battleship would cut them down in seconds. Their only hope was to hide, if they even could. The comm system crackled to life. A deep, commanding voice filled the cabin. "Unidentified vessel, power down your engines and prepare for boarding. You are fugitives of the Empire. Surrender now, or you will be destroyed." The message repeated in multiple languages. There was no room for negotiation. Jackson clenched his jaw. "We're not surrendering." Kayla grinned. "Good answer." Zavara, still weak, shook her head. "We don't have the firepower for this fight. If we're caught, we'll be executed." Jackson fought quickly. "Then we don't get caught." His mind raced, scanning the ship's systems. There was no cloaking device, no advanced tech that could help them. But there was one thing, an asteroid field not far from their position. It was dangerous, but it was their only chance. He turned to Kayla. "Can you fly through an asteroid belt?" Kayla's grin widened. "Can you hold your breath?" Jackson smirked. "Do it." Kayla grabbed the controls, yanking them hard. The ship veered violently, diving toward the thick cluster of drifting rocks. The battleship fired, energy blasts cutting through space, barely missing them. The ship rocked violently, alarms blaring, but Kayla didn't slow down. She maneuvered between the asteroids with impossible skill, twisting and rolling through the debris. The Imperial battleship hesitated at the edge of the field. It was too big to follow them directly. They had bought themselves time. Jackson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That was close. Zavara wasn't celebrating yet. They'll send scouts. We're not safe. Jackson knew she was right. They needed to find a place to hide, somewhere no one would look for them. And he had an idea. The Outlands, he said. Kayla raised an eyebrow. You mean that lawless zone where even the Empire doesn't go? Jackson nodded. Exactly. It was a gamble. The Outlands were ruled by warlords, mercenaries, and exiles. It was dangerous, but it was also the only place where the Empire's reach was weak. If they wanted to disappear, that was the place to do it. Kayla sighed. Well, we're already criminals. Might as well go all in. She punched in the coordinates, and the ship jumped to hyperspace. Hours later, they emerged in the Outlands. The sight before them was both terrifying and fascinating. A massive lawless station floated in the void, surrounded by hundreds of ships, smugglers, pirates, bounty hunters. It was a city of criminals, a place where power and reputation ruled. Jackson knew they wouldn't last long here without making a name for themselves. As they docked, he felt the weight of their journey settle on him. They had survived the prison, but now they had entered a different kind of war, a battle for survival in a world where trust was rare and betrayal was a way of life. But he wasn't afraid. Because here, in the darkest corners of the galaxy, a legend was about to be born. The legend of the human Alpha.